In graph 13.5, we introduced the notion of a long-run fixed cost, and we said that that kind of a fixed cost is associated either with an input that's always fixed, like the entrepreneurial skill of the owner of a firm, or with something like a license fee that has to be paid every year, or otherwise the firm has to exit the industry. All the other costs we previously discussed were costs associated with inputs, and there were two kinds: costs associated with inputs that are variable in the short run, and costs associated with inputs that become variable only in the long run. We'll illustrate here how these different types of costs relate to shifts in curves as the costs change. We'll begin by asking what happens if there's an increase in the long-run fixed cost, something like an increase in the license fee that a firm has to pay in order to remain in business. We therefore start with a picture of our long-run cost curves, because an increase in the long-run fixed cost doesn't change anything in the short run. So we have the long-run average cost curve and the long-run marginal cost curve, with the portion of the marginal cost curve that lies above the average cost curve denoting the firm's long-run supply curve prior to the increase in the license fee. An increase in the license fee then doesn't change the marginal cost curve at all, because the additional cost incurred by producing 6 rather than 5 units or 7 rather than 6 units doesn't change just because the license fee went up. The only thing the increase in the license fee does is it changes the cost of staying open versus closing in the long run. Thus the only curve that will shift is the average cost curve. When averaged across output, the additional license fee will be a large amount on average for low levels of output and a small amount on average for high levels of output, which implies that the new average cost curve will lie above the original average cost curve but converge to it. It also will still have the marginal cost curve cross at its lowest point. Since the long-run supply curve is the portion of the marginal cost curve that lies above average cost, the supply curve doesn't shift, it just gets shorter, because the average cost curve has moved up without the marginal cost curve shifting. We'll next consider an increase in the cost of capital, and since capital is fixed in the short run, none of the short run cost curves are affected, and so we'll just focus on the long run curves again. We'll start with a long run average cost and a long run marginal cost curve. We're here to allow the picture to come out a little clearer. We'll have the marginal cost curve be increasing throughout, which implicitly means we're assuming that the underlying production technology has decreasing returns to scale throughout. Since capital is a variable input in the long run, an increase in its cost will affect both the marginal and the average cost curves. Both will shift up, causing the long-run supply curve, the portion of the marginal cost curve that lies above average cost, to shift to the left. Finally, we'll consider an increase in the cost of labor, which is both a short-run and a long-run cost. In the long run, however, labor is just like capital. It's just a variable input, and so the long-run picture will change exactly the same way as it did when the cost of capital went up in panel B. We'll therefore focus here on the short-run picture with the short-run marginal cost and short-run average cost curves. For clarity, we'll again make the marginal cost curve upward sloping throughout, which implicitly assumes that we're assuming that the marginal product of labor is diminishing throughout. Since labor costs are variable costs in the short run, they figure into marginal costs as well as into average costs, and so both curves will shift up, causing the short-run supply curve for output to shift to the left. When a firm experiences some change in its underlying costs, we'll make a lot more progress in terms of predicting what happens to the firm's output choices if we first step back and ask, how did this change in costs affect the firm's short and long-run marginal and average cost curves? Because it's those curves that give rise to the firm's short and long-run supply curve. We'll do a lot more of this in Chapter 14, where we'll also combine this with an analysis of what happens in the industry overall.